Lilith Thomas staggered along the dusty trail, each step sending sharp pains through her swollen bare feet as the merciless Arizona sun beat down upon her. 6 months pregnant and alone on the road to Oroville, California, she'd fled from a situation that had left her with nothing but the tattered dress on her back and the child growing within her womb. The year was 1873, and the western frontier offered little mercy to a woman in her condition. Lilith had been walking since dawn, having lost her boots crossing a shallow river the previous evening. Her throat burned with thirst, her dark hair matted with sweat and dust as she pushed forward, one painful step after another. The distant mountains shimmered in the heat, seeming no closer than they had hours ago. "Just keep moving," she whispered to herself, cradling her belly protectively. "Just a few more miles to Oroville." Xavier Frost first spotted the woman from atop a ridge, his keen eyes narrowing at the unusual sight. A lone figure, clearly struggling, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone in distress. He adjusted his worn leather hat, shielding his eyes from the glare as he studied her. Even from this distance, he could tell she was in trouble. Xavier was no stranger to the harsh realities of the frontier. At 28, he'd spent the last decade working cattle drives, hunting bounties when necessary, and generally surviving the untamed wilderness of the West. But the sight of this woman, obviously pregnant and limping along barefoot, stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years. He nudged his chestnut mare forward, descending the ridge at an angle that would intercept the woman's path. As he drew closer, the details of her situation became clearer and more disturbing. Her feet were bloody, her face flushed with exertion and dehydration, her simple dress torn at the hem from catching on brush and rocks. Lilith heard the approaching hoofbeats and stiffened, her hand instinctively reaching for the small knife hidden in the folds of her dress, the only protection she had. In her experience, strangers on the trail weren't always helpful, especially to a woman alone. Xavier slowed his horse as he approached, keeping his hands visible. "Madam," he called out, his voice gentle despite its natural roughness, "you look like you could use some assistance." Lilith squinted up at the man, the sun behind him casting his face in shadow beneath the brim of his hat. She could make out a strong jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble, piercing blue eyes that studied her with concern rather than malice, and broad shoulders that spoke of a life of physical labor. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied automatically, the words coming out hoarse from her parched throat. Xavier dismounted, moving slowly so as not to startle her. He reached for his canteen. "At least take some water. It's another 15 miles to Oroville, and you won't make it in this heat without water." The mention of water broke through Lilith's wariness. She eyed the canteen with naked longing, then nodded once, accepting it with trembling hands. "Small sips," he advised as she raised it to her lips. "Too much at once will make you sick." Lilith forced herself to drink slowly despite her desperate thirst. The water was warm but clean, and it felt like heaven sliding down her throat. After a few careful sips, she reluctantly handed the canteen back. "Thank you, Mr. Frost." "Xavier Frost," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. "And you are," she hesitated, weighing the risk of giving her name against the reality that she desperately needed help. "Lilith Thomas." Xavier nodded, his eyes flickering briefly to her swollen belly before returning to her face. "Mrs. Thomas, I don't mean to pry, but you're in no condition to be walking to Oroville, especially not barefoot." Lilith's chin lifted slightly, a flash of pride and stubbornness crossing her features. "I don't have much choice in the matter, Mr. Frost." "Everyone has choices," he said simply. "And right now you can choose to accept my help." He paused, then added, "I'm heading to Oroville myself. I can take you there." Lilith looked down at her bleeding feet, then at the vast expanse of trail ahead. The pain was becoming unbearable, and she knew in her heart that she might not make it on her own. The baby kicked inside her, a reminder of her responsibility to more than just herself. "I don't have any money to pay you," she said quietly. Xavier shook his head. "I'm not asking for payment. Just trying to do the decent thing." He glanced at her feet again and made a decision. "You can't walk another step on those feet. I'll carry you." Lilith blinked in surprise. "Carry me for 15 miles? That's impossible." Not impossible, Xavier replied with a slight smile. Difficult maybe, but not impossible. I've carried calves further than that during roundup. I'm considerably heavier than a calf, Lilith said dryly, one hand resting on her belly. Xavier's smile widened, revealing a hint of warmth behind his weathered exterior. True, but calves kick a lot more. I'll manage. Before Lilith could protest further, Xavier moved to his horse and adjusted his gear, securing his pack and bedroll tightly. Then he returned to her side. May I? He asked, gesturing toward her. After a moment's hesitation, Lilith nodded. With surprising gentleness for a man his size, Xavier scooped her up, one arm behind her back and the other under her knees. She was lighter than he expected, despite her pregnancy too light, suggesting she hadn't been eating well. We'll make better time if I carry you a while than we ride a while, he explained, settling her weight in his arms. Daisy here is a good horse, but she can't carry us both the whole way at once. Lilith felt strange being held by this stranger, but the relief of being off her feet was immediate and overwhelming. Thank you, Mr. Frost, she said softly. Xavier nodded and began walking, leading his horse with one hand while carrying Lilith with steady strength. We should reach Miller's Creek by nightfall. There's water there, and we can make camp. As they traveled, Xavier maintained a respectful silence, sensing that Lilith wasn't eager to share her story. The rhythmic sound of his boots on the trail and the occasional snort from Daisy created a strangely peaceful backdrop to their journey. After about an hour, Xavier stopped beneath the shade of a gnarled oak tree. Time to give my arms a rest and let Daisy carry you for a while, he said, carefully setting Lilith down on a flat rock while he prepared the horse. You're stronger than you look, Lilith remarked, watching as he adjusted the saddle. Xavier glanced over his shoulder. Most people say I look plenty strong, he replied with a hint of amusement. Lilith felt a smile tug at her lips despite herself. I meant it as a compliment. Then I'll take it as one, he finished with the saddle and turned to her. Ready. He lifted her again, this time placing her carefully in the saddle. The elevation gave Lilith a better view of her unlikely rescuer. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable in the cities, curling slightly at the nape of his neck where it escaped his hat. His skin was tanned from long days in the sun, and she noticed a thin scar that ran along his jawline. He wore simple, practical clothes, a faded blue shirt, sturdy denim pants, and well-worn boots, but they were clean and in good repair. Xavier took Daisy's reins and began leading her along the trail, walking at a steady pace that kept them moving but didn't jostle Lilith too much. How long have you been on the trail? He asked after a while, breaking the silence. Lilith considered whether to answer, then decided there was little harm in it. 3 days from Sacramento. Before that, she trailed off, not ready to share that part of her story. Xavier nodded, not pressing for more. That's a long journey for anyone, let alone, he gestured vaguely toward her condition. Let alone a pregnant woman with no horse and no proper shoes, Lilith finished for him, a touch of bitterness in her voice. I wasn't judging, Xavier said quietly. Just noting that you must be very determined. Lilith looked out at the landscape, at the distant mountains and rolling hills. Determination is sometimes all a person has left, Mr. Frost. They continued in silence for another hour before Xavier suggested they stop to rest and eat. He helped Lilith down from the saddle and settled her in the shade of a large rock formation, then retrieved some jerky, hardtack, and dried apples from his saddlebag. It's not much, he apologized, offering her a portion, but it'll keep your strength up. Lilith accepted the food gratefully. The jerky was tough but flavorful, and the dried apples provided a welcome sweetness. As she ate, she studied her companion, who was now checking Daisy's hooves with practiced efficiency. You said you're heading to Oroville, she ventured. Do you have business there? Xavier straightened up. Of a sort. I've got a small claim outside of town. Been working it on and off for about 2 years now. A gold claim? Lilith asked with interest. The California gold rush had peaked decades ago, but many still sought their fortune in the streams and hills. Not much gold left these days, Xavier replied with a rueful smile. But enough to keep me going. The land's good too. I've been thinking of raising some cattle once I've built up enough of a stake. Lilith nodded, picturing it. Sounds like a fine plan. Xavier looked at her curiously. And what's waiting for you in Oroville, if you don't mind my asking? Lilith hesitated. A fresh start, she said finally. My cousin Abigail lives there with her husband. She's offered to take me in until. She placed a protective hand over her belly. Xavier nodded, understanding what she left unsaid. Oroville's a decent town, growing fast but still has some sense of community. Your cousin chose well. They finished their meal in companionable silence, then continued their journey, with Xavier once again carrying Lilith in his arms while leading Daisy. The afternoon sun was relentless, but Xavier maintained a steady pace, showing no signs of tiring despite his burden. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Lilith found herself growing increasingly aware of the man carrying her. Despite the heat and exertion, he smelled of leather, pine, and clean sweat, not unpleasant at all. His breathing remained steady, and his arms held her securely but gently. Tell me about yourself, Mr. Frost, she said suddenly, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to distract herself from her awareness of him. Xavier's eyes remained on the trail ahead. Not much to tell. Born in Missouri, father was a blacksmith. Headed west after the war looking for something different. Were you in the war? Lilith asked carefully. The Civil War had ended 8 years ago, but its shadows still loomed large over the nation. Briefly. Union side. Got shot in the leg at Vicksburg and sent home. His tone made it clear he didn't wish to elaborate. Lilith respected his reticence. Many men who'd lived through those bloody years preferred not to revisit them in conversation. And what about family? She asked instead. Do you have anyone waiting for you in Oroville? Xavier shook his head slightly. No family, not anymore. My parents passed years ago and I never had siblings. As for a wife, he gave a small, self-deprecating smile. Hard to court a woman properly when you're living in a cabin on a mining claim. Lilith found herself strangely relieved at his answer, then immediately chided herself for the feeling. Her situation was precarious enough without developing an interest in the first kind man she'd encountered. As the shadows lengthened, Xavier pointed to a stand of trees ahead. There's Miller's Creek. We'll make camp there for the night. The creek proved to be a small but clear stream running through a pleasant grove of cottonwoods and willows. Xavier helped Lilith dismount near the water's edge, then set about making camp with practiced efficiency. He unsaddled Daisy and let her graze, collected firewood, and cleared a spot for a small fire. Lilith insisted on helping despite her condition, gathering smaller sticks for kindling and arranging stones for the fire ring. Her feet were still painful, but the rest from walking had helped considerably. As darkness fell, Xavier got a small fire going and prepared a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and coffee. The food was plain but filling, and Lilith ate with genuine appetite for the first time in days. Your feet need tending, Xavier said after they'd eaten, nodding toward her bloodied soles. I have some salve in my pack that might help. Lilith nodded gratefully. Xavier retrieved a small tin from his saddlebags, then filled his bandana with cool water from the creek. With unexpected tenderness, he cleaned her feet, his large hands gentle as they wiped away dirt and dried blood. This might sting a bit, he warned as he opened the tin, which contained a greenish ointment with a strong herbal smell. He applied it carefully to her cuts and blisters. Lilith winced at the initial sting, then relaxed as a numbing coolness spread through her abused feet. That feels much better. Thank you. Xavier nodded, finishing his ministrations in silence. When he was done, he wrapped her feet in clean strips of cloth torn from a spare shirt. They'll heal quicker if you stay off them, he advised. We've got about 10 more miles to Oroville. We should reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we get an early start. Lilith looked at him across the fire, the flames casting moving shadows across his features. Why are you doing this, Mr. Frost? You don't know me. I could be running from the law for all you know. Xavier considered her for a long moment. Are you running from the law? No, Lilith answered honestly. I didn't think so. He poked at the fire with a stick. As for why? My mother used to say that a person's character is revealed by how they treat those who can't do anything for them in return. He shrugged slightly. I'd like to think she raised me right. Lilith felt a lump form in her throat. After months of hardship and betrayal, Xavier's simple kindness was almost more than she could bear. She blinked back tears, determined not to let him see her cry. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," she said when she could trust her voice again. "She was," Xavier agreed softly. He tossed his stick into the fire and stood up. "You should get some rest, Mrs. Thomas. I'll take first watch." "First watch? Do you expect trouble?" Xavier shook his head. "No, but it never hurts to be cautious. These hills can have all sorts of visitors after dark, two-legged and four-legged." He spread his bedroll near the fire and gestured for Lilith to take it. After a brief protest that Xavier firmly overruled, she settled onto the relatively comfortable blankets. Despite her exhaustion, she found herself watching Xavier as he moved quietly around the camp, checking on Daisy, adding wood to the fire, and finally sitting with his back against a tree trunk, his rifle across his lap. In the flickering firelight, with his hat pushed back and his face in repose, he looked younger, almost vulnerable. Lilith wondered about his life, about the experiences that had etched those faint lines around his eyes and given him that air of quiet competence. As if sensing her gaze, Xavier glanced over. Their eyes met across the fire, and something unspoken passed between them, a moment of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Then Lilith closed her eyes, surrendering to her exhaustion. She dreamed of being carried in strong arms, safe and protected for the first time in months. The sound of birdsong woke Lilith just as dawn was breaking. She opened her eyes to find Xavier kneeling by a freshly built fire, brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. He had obviously been up for some time. His face was freshly washed, his hair damp at the temples. "Good morning," he said, noticing she was awake. "How are your feet feeling?" Lilith carefully flexed her toes, assessing. "Better, still sore, but not as bad as yesterday." "Good." He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. "It's strong, fair warning." Lilith accepted the cup gratefully, blowing on the steaming liquid before taking a cautious sip. The coffee was indeed strong, but the bitter warmth was welcome in the cool morning air. "Did you sleep at all?" she asked, noticing the faint shadows under Xavier's eyes. "A few hours," he replied, turning his attention to slicing salt pork for their breakfast. "Enough." They ate a quick meal of salt pork and the last of the hardtack, then prepared to continue their journey. Xavier efficiently packed up their small camp while Lilith tried testing her weight on her bandaged feet. "They'll hold up for short distances," she said, taking a few experimental steps. "I can walk some of the way today." Xavier gave her a skeptical look. "Those bandages won't last long on the trail and the cuts will reopen. Better to stick to our arrangement from yesterday." Before Lilith could argue, he added, "Besides, we'll make better time. I'd like to get you to Oroville before nightfall." Realizing the sense in his words, Lilith acquiesced. Soon they were on their way again, with Lilith alternating between riding Daisy and being carried in Xavier's arms. As they traveled, the landscape began to change, with the hills becoming more pronounced and patches of forest appearing more frequently. "Tell me about Oroville," Lilith requested as they stopped for a brief rest around midday. "What kind of place is it?" Xavier considered his answer as he refilled their canteen from a small spring. "It's a mining town at heart, but it's settling down some. Got about 2,000 people last I heard. There's a proper downtown with a hotel, several saloons, a couple of general stores, even a small theater." He handed her the canteen. "They're building a proper courthouse now, and there's talk of bringing the railroad through in the next few years." "And the people, are they decent folk?" "Mostly," Xavier replied honestly. "Like any town, it has its share of troublemakers, but Sheriff Mills runs a tight ship. Most folks are just trying to make a living: miners, merchants, farmers. There's a small Chinese quarter on the east side of town. Good people work hard, keep to themselves mostly." He paused. "Your cousin Abigail, was it? What does her husband do?" "He owns a general store," Lilith answered. "At least that's what Abigail wrote in her last letter. I haven't seen her in nearly 5 years." Xavier nodded, seemingly satisfied with this information. "Merchant families tend to do well in Oroville. I'm sure you'll be comfortable there." They continued their journey, with Xavier pointing out landmarks and sharing bits of local history as they went. Lilith found herself increasingly drawn to this quiet, thoughtful man who carried her with such care, and asked for nothing in return. By mid-afternoon, the trail began to descend into a broad valley, and in the distance, Lilith could make out the clustered buildings of a town nestled against the foothills. Oroville, Xavier announced, a note of pride in his voice, named for the Spanish word for gold oro. Though these days, there's more money in timber and farming than in gold. As they drew closer to the town, they began to encounter other travelers on the road wagons loaded with goods, men on horseback, and even a stagecoach that rattled past in a cloud of dust. Xavier had put Lilith back on Daisy for this final stretch, walking alongside and leading the horse by the reins. "Where does your cousin live?" Xavier asked as they reached the outskirts of town. Lilith pulled Abigail's letter from the pocket of her dress. "Pine Street," she read. "She says the store is called Thomas Mercantile." Xavier nodded. "I know it. Good establishment. It's on the main street near the center of town." They made their way through Oroville's busy streets, attracting curious glances from townsfolk not accustomed to seeing a pregnant woman riding while a man walked alongside. Lilith felt suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance and bare feet, painfully aware of how she must look to these well-dressed townspeople. Xavier seemed oblivious to the stairs, leading Daisy with confidence through the bustling thoroughfare. Finally, they reached a large wooden storefront with Thomas Mercantile painted in neat black letters across the front. Xavier helped Lilith dismount carefully, supporting her weight as her bandaged feet touched the wooden sidewalk. For a moment they stood close, his hands still at her waist, their eyes meeting in silent acknowledgement that their journey together was ending. "Thank you," Lilith said softly. "I don't know how to repay your kindness." Xavier shook his head slightly. "There's nothing to repay, Mrs. Thomas." The store's door opened, and a woman stepped out, a pretty, well-dressed woman with blonde hair gathered in a neat bun. She looked at them with confusion, then recognition dawned on her face. "Lilith, is that you?" Lilith turned, relief washing over her. "Abigail." The two women embraced, Abigail exclaiming over Lilith's condition and appearance while Xavier stood awkwardly to one side, hat in hand. "What happened to you?" Abigail asked, noticing Lilith's bandaged feet. "And who is this gentleman?" "This is Mr. Xavier Frost," Lilith introduced him. "He found me on the trail yesterday when I lost my boots crossing a river. He carried me all the way here." Abigail's eyes widened. "Carried you for 15 miles. Xavier shuffled uncomfortably at the attention. "It wasn't all at once, madam, and my horse helped." "Well, Mr. Frost, you must come in," Abigail insisted. "My husband will want to thank you properly for helping my cousin." Xavier glanced at Lilith, who nodded encouragingly. "I suppose I could stay for a short while," he conceded. Inside the store, they were met by George Thomas, Abigail's husband, a tall, genial man with mutton chop whiskers and a ready smile. Upon hearing Xavier's role in bringing Lilith safely to town, he insisted on shaking Xavier's hand vigorously and offering him anything in the store, free of charge. Xavier politely declined the offer, but accepted a cup of coffee and a chair by the pot-bellied stove at the back of the store. While George minded the counter and Abigail took Lilith upstairs to clean up and change, Xavier sat quietly, observing the busy mercantile with interest. An hour later, Lilith reappeared, transformed by a simple blue dress borrowed from Abigail, her hair washed and neatly braided, and her feet now clad in soft slippers. She made her way to Xavier's side, moving carefully but with more confidence. "You clean up nice, Mrs. Thomas," Xavier said with a small smile rising as she approached. Lilith felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you, and please, after everything we've been through, I think you can call me Lilith." Xavier nodded. "Lilith, then." He glanced toward the door. "I should be going. My claim is still a few hours' ride from here, and I'd like to reach it before dark." Lilith felt a surprising pang of disappointment. "Of course, you've already done far more than could be expected." They walked together to the front of the store where Daisy was hitched to a post outside. Xavier checked his saddle and gear, then turned to face Lilith one last time. "Will you be all right here?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Lilith nodded. "Yes, Abigail and George are good people. They'll look after me until—" She trailed off, unconsciously touching her belly. Xavier's eyes followed the gesture. "And after, what then?" Lilith shrugged slightly. I haven't thought that far ahead, one step at a time, Xavier nodded, understanding. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper which he handed to her. This is a map to my claim. It's not much, but if you ever need anything at all, you can find me there. Lilith accepted the map, touched by the gesture. Thank you, Xavier. He tipped his hat, a slight smile lifting the corner of his mouth. Take care of yourself, Lilith, and that little one too. With that, he mounted Daisy and rode away, leaving Lilith standing on the sidewalk, watching until he disappeared around a corner. Only then did she realize she was still clutching the map tightly in her hand. The following weeks passed in a blur of adjustment for Lilith. Abigail and George welcomed her into their comfortable home above the store with genuine warmth, asking few questions about her past and focusing instead on preparing for the baby's arrival. George hired a young girl to help in the store so Abigail could spend more time with Lilith, and between them, they began assembling a layette of tiny clothes and blankets. Lilith gradually became known in town as the Thomases' cousin from back east, and if anyone noticed her lack of a husband, they were polite enough not to mention it directly. Oroville society, while not entirely free from judgment, was practical enough to accept that life on the frontier sometimes created unusual circumstances. Despite the comfort and security of her new situation, Lilith often found her thoughts drifting to Xavier Frost. She kept the map he had given her folded in her pocket, taking it out occasionally to trace the route to his claim with her fingertip. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when Abigail and George were busy with the store accounts, Lilith would sit by the window overlooking the main street, watching the passers-by and wondering if today might be the day Xavier came to town for supplies. But 2 months passed without any sign of him, and Lilith began to accept that their brief connection had been just that brief, a moment of kindness from a stranger that had likely meant far less to him than it had to her. It was a crisp October morning when everything changed. Lilith, now in her 8th month of pregnancy, was helping Abigail inventory fabric bolts when the bell above the store's door jingled. Glancing up, she froze at the sight of the tall figure in the doorway, Xavier Frost, his hat in his hands, looking somewhat out of place in the neat mercantile. His eyes found hers immediately, and for a moment, they simply looked at one another across the expanse of the store. Mr. Frost, George called out cheerfully, emerging from the back room. Good to see you again. What can we do for you today? Xavier tore his gaze from Lilith to address George. Just stocking up on a few supplies, Mr. Thomas. Winter's coming, and I like to be prepared. While Xavier and George discussed his needs, Abigail nudged Lilith gently. So that's your cowboy, she whispered. The one who carried you all that way. He's been watching you since the moment he walked in. Lilith felt her cheeks warm. He's not my cowboy, Abigail. He was just being kind to someone in need. Abigail raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, returning to her inventory while Lilith pretended to do the same, though her attention remained fixed on Xavier's tall form as he moved through the store with George. Finally, as Xavier was paying for his purchases, George said loudly enough for Lilith to hear, "Why don't you join us for supper tonight, Mr. Frost? Nothing fancy, but Abigail makes a fine beef stew, and I'm sure Lilith would like to properly thank you for your help." Lilith held her breath, watching as Xavier hesitated, his eyes flickering toward her. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said carefully. "Nonsense," George insisted. "It's no imposition at all. 7 o'clock." After a moment's consideration, Xavier nodded. "Thank you, I'd be honored." With the arrangement made, Xavier gathered his purchases and headed for the door, pausing briefly as he passed Lilith. "You're looking well, Mrs. Thomas," he said quietly. "Thank you, Mr. Frost," Lilith replied, equally soft. "I am much better." A ghost of a smile touched his lips, and then he was gone, leaving Lilith to face Abigail's knowing look. "Not your cowboy, hum?" Abigail teased gently. Lilith busied herself with straightening a bolt of calico. "He's a good man who did a kind thing, that's all." "If you say so," Abigail replied, unconvinced. "But I've never seen a man look at just someone he helped the way he looks at you." That evening, Lilith found herself spending an unusual amount of time on her appearance, trying on 3 different dresses, before settling on a simple green one that Abigail had altered to accommodate her growing belly. She brushed her hair until it shone, arranging it in a becoming style that framed her face. "You look lovely," Abigail said approvingly when Lilith finally emerged from their shared bedroom. "Pregnancy agrees with you." Lilith smiled self-consciously, one hand resting on her prominent belly. "I feel like a whale." "Nonsense. You're glowing." Abigail adjusted a curl that had escaped Lilith's careful arrangement. "Now, help me set the table. Our guest will be here soon." Xavier arrived precisely at 7, clean-shaven and wearing what appeared to be his best shirt, still simple and utilitarian, but newer and less worn than his usual attire. He had brought small gifts: a jar of honey from a beekeeper near his claim for Abigail, a fine leather belt for George, and most surprisingly, a tiny wooden horse for the baby, expertly carved and sanded smooth. "I've been working on it since I last saw you," he explained awkwardly as he presented it to Lilith. "Thought the little one might like something to play with when they're bigger." Lilith traced the delicate curves of the carving with her fingertip, deeply touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "It's beautiful, Xavier. Thank you." The evening passed pleasantly, with George keeping conversation flowing through a delicious meal of beef stew, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. As they ate, Xavier shared stories of life on his claim, the challenges of mining, and the small community of independent miners in the hills outside Oroville. "Found a decent vein last month," he mentioned. "Nothing spectacular, but steady. Enough that I've been able to start building a proper cabin instead of the shack I've been living in." "Planning to settle permanently then?" George asked, refilling Xavier's coffee cup. Xavier nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Lilith's across the table. "That's the plan. The claim's producing enough to live on and the land's good. Been thinking about diversifying a bit, maybe raise some cattle, grow some crops." "Sounds like you need a wife," George joked. "Can't run a farm alone." Abigail kicked him under the table, but Xavier took the comment in stride. "Perhaps someday," he said non-committally. "When the time is right." After supper, George excused himself to finish some bookkeeping for the store, and Abigail, with a meaningful glance at Lilith, announced she needed to check their supply of preserved fruits in the cellar. Left alone in the small parlor, Lilith and Xavier sat in momentary awkward silence before both speaking at once. "How have you been?" "I wanted to thank you," they broke off, sharing a small laugh at the collision of words. "Ladies first," Xavier said, gesturing for her to continue. Lilith folded her hands in her lap. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did. I've had time to think about it, and I realize now how truly dangerous my situation was, if you hadn't come along when you did." "But I did," Xavier said simply. "And you're safe now, that's what matters." Lilith studied him, noting the quiet confidence in his posture, the kindness in his blue eyes. "Why did you really help me, Xavier? The truth." Xavier considered the question carefully, his gaze steady on hers. "When I first saw you on that trail, you reminded me of someone I knew during the war, a woman who helped tend the wounded, including me. She had that same look of determination despite impossible circumstances." He paused. "She died of fever before I could repay her kindness. So when I saw you, I thought maybe this was my chance to balance that debt. And now, why are you here tonight?" A flush of color touched Xavier's cheekbones, and he looked down at his hands. "Because I haven't been able to stop thinking about you," he admitted quietly. "I told myself it was just concern for your welfare, but..." He trailed off, then met her eyes again. "I wanted to see you again." The honesty of his answer caught Lilith off guard. Since arriving in Oroville, she had become accustomed to polite fiction and careful omissions in her interactions with others. Xavier's direct admission was refreshingly different. "I've thought about you too," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "More than I probably should." Xavier leaned forward slightly. "Lilith, I don't know your story and you don't owe me an explanation, but I'd like to know you better if you'll allow it." Lilith felt a flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with the baby. "I'd like that too," she said, "and perhaps it's time I told someone my story." She took a deep breath. "If you're willing to listen." Xavier settled back in his chair. "I'm listening." Lilith gathered her thoughts, deciding where to begin. "I was born in Boston to a good family. My father was a professor at Harvard. my mother a society lady with impeccable connections. I had a comfortable upbringing, a good education. She smiled faintly. I even had a season in New York, though I found the whole business of being paraded before potential husbands rather tedious. Xavier's lips quirked in amusement, but he remained silent, letting her continue at her own pace. When I was 21, I met Richard Blackburn. He was handsome, charming, from a respectable family with railroad interests. My parents approved, and within 6 months we were married. Lilith's expression grew somber. At first, everything was wonderful. Richard was attentive and kind. We moved to San Francisco for his business interests, and for a while we were happy. She paused, her hand unconsciously moving to her belly. Then things changed. Richard became controlling. Jealous, he monitored my comings and goings, checked my correspondence, accused me of flirting with his business associates. She shook her head. I thought it was just temporary stress from his work. I tried to be more accommodating to anticipate his moods. Xavier's expression had hardened, but he still said nothing. About a year ago, he began to drink more heavily, and when he drank, he became. Lilith swallowed hard. He became violent, not often at first and always with apologies afterward, then more frequently. She looked down at her hands. When I discovered I was with child, I thought it might improve matters. Instead, it made them worse. He accused me of trapping him, of ruining his life. Xavier's jaw tightened visibly, his hands clenching on the arms of his chair. The night I left, he had been drinking heavily. He struck me and threatened worse. Said once the baby came, he would send it away to an orphanage, that he wouldn't raise another man's bastard. Lilith's voice shook with remembered fear and anger. It wasn't true the child is his, but I knew then that I had to leave, for the baby's sake if not my own. She took a steadying breath. I had been secretly saving small amounts from the household money. It wasn't much, but it was enough for train fare to Sacramento, where Abigail and George had lived before moving to Oroville. When I arrived and found they had relocated here, I used what little money I had left to join a wagon train headed this way. But my money ran out in a small settlement about 20 miles from here, and I had to continue on foot. Xavier finally spoke, his voice tight with controlled anger. This Richard, he's still in San Francisco? Lilith nodded. As far as I know. I left him a letter saying I was returning to my parents in Boston. I hoped it would throw him off my trail, at least for a while. And your parents, could they not help you? Lilith's expression grew sad. My father died 2 years ago, my mother. She believes a wife's duty is to stand by her husband, no matter what. When I wrote to her about Richard's behavior, she told me to be more patient, more understanding. She shook her head. She would send me straight back to him. Xavier was quiet for a long moment, absorbing everything she had told him. Thank you for trusting me with your story, he said finally. It couldn't have been easy to share. It's actually a relief to tell someone the whole truth, Lilith admitted. Abigail and George know some of it, but not everything. Xavier leaned forward, his eyes intent on hers. Lilith, I want you to know that if this Richard ever comes looking for you, you won't face him alone. I may be just a minor with a small claim, but I protect what I care about. The implication that she fell into the category of things Xavier Frost cared about sent a warm feeling spreading through Lilith's chest. Thank you, she said softly. That means more than you know. Their conversation was interrupted by Abigail's return from her suspiciously long cellar inspection. Sensing the changed atmosphere in the room, she raised an eyebrow at Lilith, but made no comment. As the evening wound down, Xavier reluctantly announced that he should be heading back to his claim. At the door, he paused, hat in hand. I'll be in town next Saturday for supplies, he said, looking at Lilith. Perhaps we could meet for coffee at the hotel restaurant, Lilith smiled, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in a long time. I'd like that very much. After Xavier had gone, Abigail cornered Lilith in their shared bedroom. Well, what happened while I was conveniently inspecting preserves we both know are perfectly fine. Lilith couldn't help the smile that spread across her face. We talked. I told him about Richard. Abigail's eyes widened. You told him everything, and he didn't run for the hills. Not only did he not run, but he also offered protection if Richard ever comes looking for me, Lilith replied, sitting carefully on the edge of her bed. And he asked to see me again next Saturday. Abigail sat beside her, taking Lilith's hand in hers. You like him, don't you? More than just gratitude for his help. Lilith nodded, a blush warming her cheeks. I do. He's different from any man I've known. There's a gentleness to him despite his strength, a decency. She sighed. But my situation is hardly ideal. What man wants to court a pregnant woman fleeing from her husband? A man who sees beyond circumstances to the person within, Abigail said firmly. And from the way he looks at you, I'd say Xavier Frost is exactly that kind of man. The following Saturday, Lilith met Xavier for coffee as planned. The hotel restaurant was one of Oroville's more refined establishments, with white tablecloths and real china cups. Xavier seemed slightly uncomfortable in such surroundings, but made an obvious effort to fit in, his clothes clean and pressed, his manner carefully polite. They talked for hours, sharing stories from their childhoods, discovering shared interests in books and music, and laughing at each other's anecdotes. Lilith found herself relaxing completely in Xavier's company, free from the constant tension that had characterized her marriage to Richard. As their meeting drew to a close, Xavier walked her back to the mercantile, moving at a pace that accommodated her increasingly uncomfortable waddle. May I see you again? He asked as they reached the store's entrance. I'd be disappointed if you didn't, Lilith replied with a smile. Thus began a pattern of regular visits. Every Saturday, Xavier would come to town, conduct his business, and spend time with Lilith. Sometimes they would have coffee at the hotel. Other times they would take short walks along Oroville's quieter streets, Xavier offering his arm for support as Lilith's pregnancy advanced. On one such walk in early November, they paused at a small park overlooking the Feather River. The autumn air was crisp, the trees ablaze with color against the clear blue sky. I've been thinking, Xavier said as they sat on a bench watching the river flow by. My cabin is nearly finished. It's not grand, but it's sturdy and warm. I've added a second bedroom. He glanced at Lilith's profile. Just in case. Lilith turned to look at him, understanding the implication of his words. Xavier, are you suggesting? He took her hand carefully in his. I know it's soon, and I know your situation is complicated, but I've grown to care for you deeply, Lilith. For both of you, he added, nodding toward her belly. I'm not asking for promises right now. I'm just letting you know that when you're ready, if you're ever ready, there's a place for you, for both of you. Lilith felt tears prick at her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple sincerity of his offer. But the baby, it's not yours. It would be, Xavier said firmly. In every way that matters if you'd allow it. Before Lilith could respond, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and clutch at her belly. Xavier was instantly alert, his hand steadying her shoulder. Lilith, what is it? I'm not sure, she said, breathing carefully as the pain subsided. It passed quickly, probably just the baby moving. Xavier didn't look convinced. Perhaps we should head back, you should rest. They made their way slowly back toward the mercantile, but they had only gone a short distance when another pain, stronger than the first, made Lilith stop in her tracks. Xavier, she said, her voice tight, I think the baby might be coming. Xavier's eyes widened in alarm. But it's too soon, isn't it? You said January. Early January, Lilith confirmed, grimacing as the pain eased. This is early but not dangerously so. We need to get back to Abigail and George's. Abigail will know what to do. Xavier didn't hesitate. With gentle efficiency, he swept Lilith into his arms, carrying her just as he had that day on the trail. Xavier, you don't have to. Seems I make a habit of carrying you when you need it most. He interrupted with a forced smile, already striding purposefully toward the mercantile. By the time they reached the store, Lilith's pains were coming more frequently. Abigail took one look at them and immediately took charge, sending George for the midwife while she helped Lilith upstairs to her bedroom. Xavier paced anxiously in the store below as George went about closing up for the day. Is there anything I can do? He asked for the third time. George clapped a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. Not much men can do at a time like this except wait and pray. Midwife Hernandez is the best in the county, and Abigail's been through this with her sisters back east. Lilith is in good hands. As evening fell, the waiting continued. Xavier remained downstairs, alternating between sitting rigidly in a chair by the stove and pacing the length of the store. Occasionally, sounds from above would make him freeze, his face a mask of concern. It was well past midnight when the cry of a newborn finally broke the tense silence. Xavier's head snapped up, his eyes fixed on the ceiling as if he could see through it. A few minutes later, George appeared at the top of the stairs, his face wreathed in smiles. "A boy," he announced proudly. "A fine, healthy boy, and Lilith is well, just exhausted." Relief washed over Xavier in a tangible wave. "Thank God," he murmured. "Can I?" "Would it be proper for me to see them?" George hesitated, then nodded. "Abigail says you can come up for a brief visit. The midwife has gone to check on another patient but will return in the morning." Xavier followed George up the narrow stairs to a small bedroom at the back of the house. Inside, Lilith reclined against a mound of pillows, her face pale but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. Abigail sat beside the bed, a basin of water and some cloths nearby. "Xavier," Lilith said softly as he entered, her voice tired but happy. "Come meet Thomas, Xavier Thomas." Xavier approached the bed almost reverently, his eyes fixed on the tiny red face visible among the swaddling cloths. "Thomas Xavier," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Lilith nodded. "If that's all right with you, he needs a strong name and I couldn't think of anyone stronger." Xavier knelt beside the bed, studying the newborn's features, the perfect miniature fingers, the rosebud mouth, the wisp of dark hair. "He's beautiful," he whispered. "Perfect." Impulsively, he reached out to touch the baby's cheek, then hesitated, looking to Lilith for permission. She nodded, and Xavier gently stroked his fingertip along the incredibly soft skin. "Hello, Thomas," he said, his voice barely audible. "Welcome to the world." The baby squirmed slightly, his tiny hand closing reflexively around Xavier's finger. The simple gesture seemed to overwhelm Xavier completely. He bowed his head, shoulders shaking with silent emotion. Abigail and George quietly slipped from the room, leaving the three of them alone. For several minutes, no one spoke, the only sounds the baby's soft breathing and the crackle of the small fire in the grate. Finally, Xavier raised his head, his eyes meeting Lilith's. "Thank you," he said simply. "For what?" "For letting me be part of this, for naming him." He trailed off, overcome again. Lilith reached out with her free hand to touch his cheek. "You carried me when I couldn't walk. You showed me kindness when I needed it most. You offered a future when I thought mine was lost. Giving our son your name is the least I can do." Xavier turned his face to press a kiss into her palm. "Our son," he repeated, the words filled with wonder. "Lilith, I know this isn't the right time and there are complications to consider, but I want you to know that what I said earlier today still stands. When you're ready, when you and Thomas are ready, there's a place for you with me. Always." Lilith's eyes filled with tears. "I need time, Xavier. Time to heal, time to establish myself as more than just a refugee from a bad marriage, time to be a mother to Thomas." "Take all the time you need," Xavier said earnestly. "I'll wait, however long it takes." The weeks following Thomas's birth were a whirlwind of adjustment for Lilith. The baby was healthy but demanding, and she found herself exhausted from the constant cycle of feeding, changing, and soothing. Abigail was an invaluable help, taking care of Thomas when Lilith needed rest and offering practical advice drawn from her experience with her sister's children. Xavier continued his weekly visits to town, now bringing small gifts for Thomas as well, soft blankets, tiny moccasins crafted by a local Native American woman, a silver rattle that must have cost him a significant portion of his mining proceeds. During these visits, he would hold the baby with surprising confidence while Lilith rested, singing old Missouri folk songs in a deep, gentle voice that never failed to soothe Thomas to sleep. As winter settled over Oroville, the three of them fell into a comfortable routine. Xavier would arrive on Saturday mornings, spend the day helping in the store or assisting George with repairs around the house, then join them for dinner. Afterward, he would sit with Lilith in the small parlor, Thomas sleeping in a cradle nearby, and they would talk about everything and nothing, his progress on the claim, her growing interest in possibly teaching once Thomas was older, books they had read, places they hoped to see someday. It was during one of these quiet evenings in late January, with snow falling gently outside the window, that Lilith finally broached the subject they had been dancing around for months. "I've been thinking about your offer," she said, her hands busy with some mending. "About there being a place for Thomas and me at your cabin." Xavier, who had been whittling a small toy soldier for Thomas, looked up, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh," Lilith set her sewing aside, "there's still the matter of my marriage to Richard. Legally, I'm still his wife and Thomas is his son." "Have you heard from him at all?" Xavier asked, his tone even but his eyes sharp. Lilith shook her head. "No, and that worries me somewhat. Richard isn't the type to simply let go of what he considers his property." She sighed. "I've been speaking with Judge Wilson about my options. He says that in California, I could potentially file for divorce on grounds of cruelty, but it would require me to publicly accuse Richard, possibly even appear in court." Xavier set his whittling aside. "Would that be so terrible?" "You have witnesses to your condition when you arrived, George, Abigail, myself. The doctor who examined you noted the healing bruises." "It's not just that," Lilith explained. "A divorce, especially one with such public accusations, would create a scandal. Richard's family is powerful, with connections throughout California. They could make things very difficult for us for Thomas." She hesitated. "And for you if you were associated with me." Xavier moved to sit beside her on the small settee. "Lilith, look at me." When she raised her eyes to his, he continued, "I don't care about scandals or powerful families. I care about you and Thomas. Whatever comes, we would face it together." Lilith studied his face, noting the determination in his blue eyes, the set of his jaw. "You really mean that, don't you?" "With all my heart," Xavier replied simply. Lilith took a deep breath. "Then I think it's time I spoke with Judge Wilson again. Time to take control of my future, our future." Over the next few months, Lilith worked with Judge Wilson to prepare her case for divorce. The process was complex and daunting, involving formal legal complaints, sworn affidavits from witnesses to her condition upon arrival in Oroville, and documentation from the doctor who had examined her. Throughout it all, Xavier remained steadfast in his support, accompanying her to meetings with the judge and providing testimony about her state when he found her on the trail. By late spring, the legal proceedings were underway. As Lilith had feared, the response from San Francisco was swift and vicious. Richard's family hired expensive lawyers who filed countercharges, claiming Lilith had abandoned her husband without cause and kidnapped his rightful heir. They demanded Thomas be returned to his father immediately. The accusations hit Oroville like a thunderclap, sending ripples of gossip through the small community. To Lilith's surprise and gratitude, however, the town largely rallied around her. The women of Oroville, many of whom had come to know Lilith through the mercantile, organized a support committee. The local newspaper editor, after a long conversation with Xavier, published an editorial condemning domestic violence and supporting a woman's right to protect herself and her child. Through it all, Thomas continued to grow and thrive, oblivious to the legal battles being waged over his future. He was a happy, healthy baby with Lilith's dark hair and a smile that could melt the hardest heart. Xavier doted on him, spending every spare moment engaged in the kind of rough and tumble play that made Thomas shriek with delight. It was during this tense waiting period that Xavier's claim finally yielded a significant strike. After months of steady but modest returns, he uncovered a vein rich enough to secure their future, regardless of the outcome of the legal proceedings. "It's a sign," he told Lilith the evening he shared the news. "Providence looking out for us when we need it most." Lilith, who had been wrestling with feelings of guilt over the expense and trouble her situation was causing, felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "It does seem that way, doesn't it?" As summer approached, bringing hot, dry days and the constant threat of wildfires in the surrounding hills, word came that Richard Blackburn himself was traveling to Oroville to contest the divorce in person. The news sent Lilith into a panic. "What if he tries to take Thomas?" she fretted, pacing the small parlor while Xavier watched from his seat by the window. "What if the judge sides with him? He's wealthy, respected in San Francisco society." Xavier rose and gently caught her hands, stopping her nervous movement. "Lilith, listen to me. No one is taking Thomas anywhere, not while I draw breath." The quiet conviction in his voice steadied her. "What can we do?" "We prepare," Xavier said simply. "We make sure Judge Wilson has all the evidence he needs. We show this town who we really are, so they'll stand with us when Richard tries to paint us as villains." He squeezed her hands gently. "And we trust in each other and in God to see us through." The day Richard Blackburn arrived in Oroville was unseasonably hot, the kind of day that made tempers flare and patience wear thin. Lilith, who had been braced for the confrontation for weeks, was nonetheless caught off guard when Richard walked into the mercantile while she was minding the counter during George's lunch break. He looked much as she remembered, handsome in an aristocratic way, impeccably dressed in a suit that cost more than most miners made in a year, his dark hair and mustache precisely groomed. But his eyes, which had once charmed her, now seemed cold and calculating as they assessed her. "Lilith," he said, his voice carrying the cultured tones of Boston society despite his years in California. "You've led me on quite a chase." Lilith straightened, thankful that Thomas was upstairs with Abigail for his nap. "Hello, Richard, I wasn't hiding." He gave a mirthless laugh. "No. You left a note saying you were returning to your mother, yet here you are in this quaint little mining town." His gaze swept dismissively around the mercantile, playing shopkeeper and, from what I hear, consorting with a common miner. His lip curled. "How the mighty have fallen." Lilith refused to be baited. "Is there something you want, Richard? Besides humiliating me?" His expression hardened. "I want what's mine. My son. You've embarrassed me, Lilith, filing these ridiculous charges, spreading lies about our marriage, but I'm willing to be generous. Return to San Francisco with me and the child, and I'll forget this unfortunate episode. We can start fresh." "Start fresh," Lilith repeated incredulously. "After you beat me, after you threatened our child." Richard's eyes darted to the door, checking that they were alone. "Keep your voice down," he hissed. "You're becoming hysterical as usual. This is precisely why you need my guidance." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Be reasonable, Lilith. What kind of life can you offer our son here, the bastard son of a divorcee raised by a dirt-poor miner? With me, he'll have the best education, the right connections. He'll inherit my father's business empire. And what happens when he cries too loudly or spills something on your fine carpets?" Lilith countered, standing her ground despite the fear churning in her stomach. "Will you guide him the way you guided me? With your fists?" Richard's face flushed with anger. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. No judge will believe these wild accusations. It's your word against mine, and I am a respected businessman with friends in the governor's office. And I'm the woman who arrived in this town battered and barefoot, carrying your child," Lilith replied steadily. "A woman who was carried for 15 miles by a man who had never met her before, simply because he couldn't bear to see her suffer." The mercantile door opened, the bell jingling cheerfully in contrast to the tense atmosphere. Xavier stepped inside, his tall frame filling the doorway. He took in the scene with a glance. Lilith behind the counter, her face pale but determined, and the well-dressed stranger standing too close, radiating hostility. "Everything all right, Lilith?" Xavier asked, his voice deceptively mild as he moved further into the store. Richard turned, his eyes narrowing as he assessed Xavier from head to toe. "And this must be the gallant miner I've heard so much about, come to protect your investment." Xavier ignored him, looking only at Lilith. "Lilith, should I fetch George?" She shook her head slightly. "No, that won't be necessary. Mr. Blackburn was just leaving." Richard's mouth twisted in a sneer. "Oh, I don't think so. We haven't finished our discussion about my son." "Our son is napping," Lilith said firmly, "and there's nothing more to discuss. The court will decide this matter, not us." "The court?" Richard scoffed. "This backwater excuse for a legal system. Don't be naive, Lilith. I could buy and sell this entire town if I wanted to." Xavier stepped closer, his expression unchanged but his posture subtly shifting to one of readiness. "Mr. Blackburn, I think it would be best if you left now. You can make your case to the judge tomorrow, as planned." Richard's gaze flicked between them, clearly reassessing the situation. After a tense moment, he straightened his jacket and adopted a more conciliatory tone. "Very well. Tomorrow then, but think carefully about my offer, Lilith. It's the best one you're going to get." With a final cold glance at Xavier, he turned and strode from the store. As soon as the door closed behind him, Lilith sagged against the counter, her legs suddenly weak. Xavier was at her side instantly, his arm supporting her. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern etching his features. Lilith nodded, though she felt far from all right. "Just shaken. I knew seeing him would be difficult, but I didn't expect." She trailed off, struggling to articulate the complex emotions Richard's presence had stirred: fear, anger, but also a surprising sense of strength. "I stood my ground," she said finally, with a touch of wonder. "I didn't cower or apologize, I stood my ground." Xavier's expression softened with pride. "Yes, you did. You were magnificent." He hesitated, then asked, what offer was he talking about? Lilith explained Richard's proposal that she return to San Francisco with Thomas. He made it sound so reasonable, as if he were doing me a favor by allowing me to come back after I embarrassed him. Xavier's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice level. "And what did you think of his offer?" "I thought it was exactly what I'd expect from Richard: manipulation wrapped in a veneer of generosity." Lilith shook her head. "I would rather live in a tent in the wilderness than return to that life." Relief flashed across Xavier's features. "Good." "Because I was prepared to propose something quite different." He took her hands in his. "Lilith, I know the timing is terrible with the hearing tomorrow and everything unsettled, but I don't want to wait any longer." He took a deep breath. "Marry me as soon as your divorce is finalized. Let me be a real father to Thomas. Let me protect you both legally as well as in every other way." Lilith stared at him, momentarily speechless. Despite the months of growing closer, despite the clear direction of their relationship, she hadn't expected a formal proposal now, with Richard's presence hanging over them like a storm cloud. "Xavier, are you certain Richard won't give up easily? This could get ugly." "I've never been more certain of anything," Xavier replied, his blue eyes steady on hers. "Whatever comes, we face it together. That's what family does." Family, the word resonated deeply within Lilith. She thought of Thomas upstairs, of the loving way Xavier held him, of the future they could build together, a future founded on respect and kindness rather than fear and control. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." Xavier's face lit with a joy so pure and unguarded that it brought tears to Lilith's eyes. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. "I love you, Lilith Thomas," he whispered against her hair. "You and Thomas both." "And we love you," she whispered back, feeling, despite the challenges ahead, that she was finally, truly home. The courthouse in Oroville was a simple but dignified wooden building at the center of town. On the morning of the hearing, it seemed as if half the town had gathered to witness the proceedings, their presence a silent testament to the community's interest in the outcome. Inside, the main courtroom was packed to capacity. Richard sat at one table with his attorney, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit who had traveled from San Francisco specifically for the case. Lilith sat at the opposite table with Judge Wilson, who had agreed to represent her. Xavier sat directly behind her, close enough that she could feel his reassuring presence. Thomas, to Lilith's relief, was safely with Abigail at the Mercantile, away from the tension and scrutiny of the courthouse. Judge Carson, a gray-haired man with keen eyes and a reputation for fairness, called the court to order. The proceedings began with the reading of Lilith's petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty, followed by Richard's counter-petition claiming abandonment and parental kidnapping. Richard's attorney presented his case first, painting Richard as a devoted husband betrayed by an unstable wife who had fled with his heir, and was now living in a morally questionable arrangement with a minor of uncertain reputation. He called several witnesses from San Francisco society who testified to Richard's excellent character and Lilith's increasingly erratic behavior in the months before her departure. When it was Lilith's turn, Judge Wilson called her to the stand. With quiet dignity, she recounted the pattern of abuse, the escalation after her pregnancy, and the final night when she had feared for her life and her unborn child's safety. Though her voice occasionally trembled, she did not falter, meeting Richard's cold stare across the courtroom without flinching. Next came the doctor who had examined Lilith upon her arrival in Oroville, who testified to the extensive bruising consistent with physical abuse. Abigail and George followed, describing Lilith's condition when she reached them and her consistent character during the months she had lived with them. Finally, Xavier took the stand. In his straightforward, unembellished manner, he described finding Lilith on the trail pregnant, barefoot, exhausted, but determined to reach safety for her child's sake. "And you carried her all the way to Oroville," Judge Wilson clarified. "Yes, sir," Xavier replied simply. 15 miles, give or take. She couldn't walk on those feet and she was carrying a child. What else could a decent man do? The courtroom was silent, many spectators visibly moved by the image his words evoked. "And since that time, you've developed a relationship with Mrs. Blackburn." Wilson continued. "I have," Xavier acknowledged. "I've come to deeply respect her courage and character. I've watched her be a loving mother to her son. And yes, I've asked her to marry me once her divorce is finalized." Richard's attorney jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this testimony proves our contention that Mrs. Blackburn's petition is motivated by her desire to enter into a new relationship, not by any legitimate grievance against her lawful husband." Judge Carson raised a hand for silence. "I'll determine what this testimony proves, Counselor." He turned back to Xavier. "Mr. Frost, do you have any personal knowledge of Mr. Blackburn's treatment of his wife before she left San Francisco?" "No, Your Honor," Xavier answered honestly. "I only know what I saw when I found her and what she's told me since." "And what did you see exactly?" Xavier's gaze was steady. "I saw a woman who had been hurt. Not just her feet, though they were torn up badly from walking barefoot. She had healing bruises on her arms and a fading one on her cheek. She was too thin for a woman in her condition, and she flinched when I reached toward her the way people do when they're used to being struck." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, Mr. Frost. You may step down." After a brief recess, both attorneys presented their closing arguments. Richard's counsel emphasized the sanctity of marriage, the risk to social order if women could simply abandon their husbands and take their children, and Richard's ability to provide a superior upbringing for Thomas. Judge Wilson focused on the evidence of abuse, Lilith's right to protect herself and her child, and the strong community support she had built in Oroville. Judge Carson listened impassively to both sides, then announced he would deliver his ruling after a short deliberation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as he retired to his chambers. During the wait, Lilith sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Xavier moved forward to sit beside her, his solid presence a comfort. "Whatever happens," he murmured, "remember you're not alone anymore." Lilith nodded, drawing strength from his certainty. When Judge Carson returned, the courtroom fell silent. He looked first at Richard, then at Lilith, his expression unreadable. "This case," he began, "presents difficult questions about the balance between the sanctity of marriage and the safety of individuals within that marriage. The law recognizes extreme cruelty as grounds for divorce, but the burden of proof falls heavily on the petitioner." He paused. "Having carefully considered all testimony and evidence presented, I find that Mrs. Lilith Thomas Blackburn has met that burden of proof." A soft murmur ran through the courtroom. Lilith closed her eyes briefly, feeling a wave of relief wash over her. "Therefore," the judge continued, "I grant the petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty. Further, I award full custody of the minor child, Thomas Xavier Thomas, to his mother, with no visitation rights for the father at this time." Richard stood abruptly, his face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage. You can't possibly—" "Sit down, Mr. Blackburn," Judge Carson ordered sharply. "I'm not finished." He waited until Richard reluctantly resumed his seat before continuing. "Given the evidence of Mr. Blackburn's violent tendencies and his threats regarding the child, I am also issuing a restraining order preventing him from approaching within 100 yards of Mrs. Thomas or the child." He shuffled his papers, then added, "Finally, while I recognize that Mrs. Thomas fled without securing her personal property, I find that, under the circumstances, this was a reasonable course of action for her safety. Therefore, Mr. Blackburn is ordered to return her personal effects, including clothing, jewelry, and any items she brought to the marriage within 30 days. The judge looked around the courtroom. This matter is adjudicated. Court is adjourned. The rap of his gavel seemed to release a dam of emotion in Lilith. Tears flowed freely down her cheeks as she turned to Xavier, who gathered her into his arms without hesitation. "It's over," she whispered against his chest. "It's really over." "No," Xavier replied softly, tilting her chin up so she could see his smile. "It's just beginning." 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day much like the one when they had first met, Lilith and Xavier were married in Oroville's small church. The building was filled to capacity with townsfolk who had supported them through the divorce proceedings and had come to consider them part of the community's fabric. Lilith wore a simple ivory dress that Abigail had helped her make, with Thomas's birthstone a deep blue sapphire that matched Xavier's eyes pinned at her throat. Xavier, freshly shaven and looking somewhat uncomfortable in his new suit, waited at the altar with George standing as his best man. Thomas, now an active toddler of nearly 1 year, was carried down the aisle by Abigail, who served as Lilith's matron of honor. He wore a miniature suit that matched his soon-to-be official father's and clutched a small wooden horse, the first gift Xavier had given him, in his chubby hand. As Lilith walked down the aisle to the strains of a hymn played on the church's small organ, she caught Xavier's eye and saw in his expression everything she had once thought lost to her love: respect, the promise of a future built on trust rather than fear. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, with vows they had written themselves that acknowledged the unusual path that had brought them together and the commitment they were making not just to each other, but to Thomas as well. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Xavier's kiss was gentle but filled with promise, eliciting approving applause from the congregation. The celebration afterward was held at their new home, a comfortable farmhouse Xavier had built on his claim with the proceeds from his fortunate strike. It sat on a rise overlooking a small valley, with the mining operation discreetly tucked away behind a stand of pines. A barn and corral stood ready for the cattle Xavier planned to introduce in the spring, and a garden plot had been prepared for Lilith's use. Inside, the house was simple but well-crafted, with sturdy furniture Xavier had either made himself or traded for with other skilled craftsmen in the area. The main room featured a large stone fireplace, comfortable chairs, and bookshelves already filled with volumes Lilith had collected. Thomas's room adjoined theirs, with a hand-carved crib and a rocking chair positioned near the window to catch the morning light. As their guests mingled in the yard, enjoying the feast that Abigail and the women of Oroville had prepared, Lilith found a quiet moment with Xavier on the porch of their new home. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Lilith leaned into him, watching as George entertained Thomas by tossing him gently in the air, the child's delighted laughter carrying across the yard. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. "It's strange to think that a year ago I was at my lowest point, walking barefoot on that trail, not knowing if Thomas and I would survive." Xavier's arm tightened around her. "You were never going to give up." "That's what I saw in you from the first, that determination to keep going, to protect your child, no matter what." Lilith turned in his embrace to face him. "And you really saw me when I felt invisible. You carried me when I couldn't walk another step. You gave me strength when mine was failing." Xavier brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "And you gave me a family when I thought I would always be alone. A fair exchange, I'd say." As the sun began to set over the distant mountains, casting a golden glow over their home and the gathered friends who had become family, Lilith knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world not as someone's possession or ornament, but as a partner, a mother, a woman valued for herself. "I love you, Xavier Frost," she said softly. "And I love you, Lilith Frost," he replied, the new name still sounding wonderful to both their ears. From the yard, Thomas called "Pa, Pa," in his clear little voice, arms outstretched toward Xavier. It was a recent development, this naming, and one that never failed to bring a look of wonder to Xavier's face. "Duty calls," he said with a smile, but before he went to the child, he kissed Lilith once more, a kiss that held the promise of the night to come, and all the nights after that. A promise of a life built together, step by careful step, just as they had walked that long road to Oroville. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of hoofbeats on the road caused Lilith to look up from the garden where she was harvesting late summer tomatoes. Shading her eyes against the bright August sun, she smiled at the sight of Xavier returning from town, Thomas riding proudly in front of him on the saddle, and 3-year-old Emma bouncing excitedly in her father's arms. At 6, Thomas was already showing signs of the man he would become, sturdy and serious like Xavier, but with Lilith's quick mind and curiosity. Emma, born 9 months after their wedding, was pure sunshine, adventurous, chatty, with Xavier's blue eyes and a mop of unruly blonde curls that defied any attempt at taming. "Mama," Emma called out, waving frantically, "we got candy, and a letter from Aunt Abigail." Xavier guided his horse to the hitching post near the barn, then carefully dismounted with Emma still in his arms before helping Thomas down. The boy immediately ran to Lilith, reaching into his pocket to produce a slightly squashed peppermint stick. "I saved mine to share with you," he announced proudly. Lilith accepted the sticky offering with appropriate solemnity. "Thank you, sweetheart. That was very thoughtful." She looked up as Xavier approached with Emma still chattering in his arms. "Successful trip to town." Xavier leaned down to kiss her, a gesture that still held all the warmth of their early days together. "Very. The cattle sale went through, got a fair price for the whole herd, and George says he'll take all the vegetables we can spare for the store." In the 5 years since their marriage, Xavier's dream of building a cattle ranch had become a thriving reality. The mining claim still produced enough to be worth maintaining, but the real success had come from Xavier's instinct for breeding quality stock. Meanwhile, Lilith's garden had expanded into a small truck farm, supplying fresh produce to the mercantile and several restaurants in Oroville. "And what's this about a letter from Abigail?" Lilith asked, tickling Emma's round cheek. Xavier reached into his shirt pocket and produced an envelope. "Just arrived on yesterday's stage, apparently." Abigail and George had moved to Sacramento 2 years earlier when George was offered a partnership in a larger mercantile company. The distance meant visits were rare but cherished occasions. Lilith opened the letter eagerly, scanning its contents while Xavier took the children to wash up after their journey. Her exclamation of delight brought him back to the garden a few minutes later, alone. "Good news?" he asked, taking a seat beside her on the wooden bench beneath the large oak tree that shaded the garden. "The best," Lilith replied, her eyes shining. "Abigail's expecting. After all these years of trying, they're finally going to have a baby. She's due in February." Xavier's face lit with genuine pleasure. "That is good news. They'll make wonderful parents. She wants me to come stay with her for the birth," Lilith continued. "She says no one else knows as much about babies as I do, which I find highly doubtful, but—" She looked up at Xavier questioningly. "What do you think? Could you manage with the children for a few weeks?" Xavier pretended to consider the question seriously. "Well, I suppose I could try not to burn down the house or lose either of our offspring while you're gone." At her playful swat to his arm, he laughed. "Of course we'll manage. Thomas is a responsible young man, and Emma—" He paused. "Well, Emma will keep me on my toes, that's certain." Their daughter's adventurous spirit had already resulted in several minor emergencies, including a memorable incident involving a skunk, the neighbor's prize rooster, and Emma's Sunday dress. Perhaps Mrs. Jennings could help with Emma during the day, Lilith suggested, referring to their nearest neighbor, a widow who often watched the children when Lilith and Xavier both needed to work. Xavier nodded. "We'll work it out. Abigail was there for you. You should be there for her." Lilith leaned against him, grateful as always for his understanding. "I was thinking we could all go to Sacramento for Christmas, then you and the children could return while I stay on for the birth." "That sounds perfect," Xavier agreed. "It's been too long since we had a proper visit with them." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. From inside the house came the sounds of children's laughter and the clatter of plates as Thomas and Emma, presumably, attempted to set the table for dinner. We should probably go supervise before they break all our dishes, Lilith said, making no move to rise. Xavier chuckled, his arm tightening around her shoulders. Probably, he agreed, equally immobile. Lilith turned to look at him, studying the face that had become as familiar to her as her own. At 33, Xavier was in his prime, the hard work of ranching keeping him fit, the satisfaction of their life together having softened the lines that had once marked his forehead. The scar along his jawline had faded to a thin white line, barely noticeable unless one knew to look for it. What? He asked, catching her scrutiny. I was just thinking about that day on the trail, Lilith said softly. How different my life would have been if you hadn't come along when you did. Xavier shook his head slightly. You would have made it to Oroville somehow. You're the strongest person I know, Lilith. Perhaps, she allowed, but I'm glad I didn't have to. I'm glad it was your arms that carried me to safety, your heart that opened to Thomas before he was even born. She touched his cheek gently. I'm glad it was you. Xavier turned his head to press a kiss to her palm, a gesture that had become a wordless expression of tenderness between them over the years. As am I, he said simply, every day. A crash from inside the house, followed by Emma's distinctive wail and Thomas's aggrieved protest of "it wasn't my fault," broke the moment. Lilith and Xavier exchanged a look that contained equal parts exasperation and amusement, before rising together to deal with whatever minor disaster had befallen their home. As they walked hand in hand toward the house that had sheltered their growing family for 5 years, Lilith reflected that this, too, was love, this partnership in the small crises and everyday moments, this shared responsibility for the lives they had created together. A far cry from that desperate journey on the dusty trail to Oroville, when she had been alone and afraid, her future as uncertain as her next painful step. A journey that had ended in the strong arms of a man whose quiet strength had carried her not just to physical safety, but to a life filled with the kind of love she had once thought existed only in storybooks. A love built step by step, day by day, with patience and understanding and the willingness to carry each other when the path grew too difficult to walk alone.